She's a black magic woman. She's trying to make a devil out of me.
Today I am pretty excited because I finally get to talk about a book I enjoyed. That book would be The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. If you don't know what a final girl is, I didn't know what a final girl was. If you like horror movies, the final girl is the last girl or the last person left standing. So in I Know What You Did Last Summer, that would be Jennifer Love Hewitt. Although technically she wasn't actually the only person left standing, but she could be a final girl. I've never actually seen the Halloween movies, but that would be Jamie Lee Curtis. She is the final girl. The Friday the 13th movies, Nightmare on Elm Street, all of those, that final girl who is left standing, that is the final girl. So the Final Girl Support Group is, you guessed it, about a bunch of final girls who are in a support group. The narrator of this novel is a woman named Lynnette, and she, in terms of being a final girl, if I had a criticism of the novel, it's that it took a really long time to get to know Lynnette, to understand why she's in this support group. No, it's not Lynnette. I'm sorry. It took a really long time to figure out what happened to her as to why she's in this support group. As far as the other girls are concerned, she's not actually a final girl, because a final girl fights back. A final girl kills her attacker. Whether or not there's a sequel, she fought back to escape, and Lynnette played dead. She played possum in order to escape the murderer. The book opens with the support group gathering, and they've done this for about 20 years. The thing about all these women is their stories spawned movies. Their stories all generally happened in the 80s. So in the 80s, there was this huge resurgence and popularity of slasher films, and some did well, some did not do well. The girls are all meeting, and yeah, they've been doing this for nigh on 20 years. But by this point, things are not going very well. The meetings aren't so much therapeutic as they are war sessions. At this particular meeting, before I get into it, the girls in the group are Adrian, Marilyn, Danny, Julia, Heather, and Lynnette. Adrian, her story is very Friday the 13th, with the whole things take place at a camp and murders start to happen. Heather, I have no idea what her story is. I have tried to Google it. It's called The Dream Killer. I've tried to Google the movie. It's apparently like super D-list, like really, really bad. But there's no good synopsis out there, so I couldn't tell you. In that, we really don't get an in-depth explanation as to what happened to Heather. If you've read this book and you can explain it to me, please do. Technically, a final member of this final girl support group named Christy, but she is like the black sheep because she capitalizes on being a final girl in a wrong way. Sort of like Stockholm Syndrome, where she sympathized with her captor, with her abductor, with her potential murderer, and so she has spent her time supporting all of the other girls' monsters, or just any other monster out there. But at the end of the novel, when Lynnette is trying to, get everything to come together, she visits Christy, and Christy has collected memorabilia of psychopaths and murders and all that kind of stuff, and it created a museum out of it. Each of the girls from this support group has her own room, but Heather's room, we basically open the door, no description, we're just given the sense that it's horrific, and then close the door and we move on. So I don't have anything to tell you about Heather, but she has drug addiction and alcohol addiction. She likes to use the other women for money. She does tend to start a lot of fights, which leads me to Julia. She is in a wheelchair. I feel like her story is very, I Know What You Did Last Summer. Hers was her boyfriend and his friend, and this doesn't make sense to me at all, and I actually didn't Google her story too much, but he and his friend wanted to make her a final girl. So they go around killing people in their high school, and then they tried to kill her. She escapes, but then she gets a sequel because somebody else, I forget who it is, tries to take up the mantle while she's in college. And this is the whole I Know What You Did Last Summer thing, because it's very similar to what happens in the sequel. This new guy comes, eventually attacks her roommate, and then in an attempt to save her roommate, she knocks him out of a window, and then she becomes paralyzed, at the end of the fall. She is very angry. She and Heather tend to get into it, and she also has a lot of opinions about stuff, political opinions, and just all kinds of stuff. Then we have Adrian, who, as I said, well, we're not going to get into her just yet. There's Marilyn, who, this one, we get bits and pieces straight up from Lynnette about the women's experiences, but largely the explanations come from snippets throughout the novel, media things, articles, journal entries, police interviews, things like that. Marilyn's, I felt, was a little confusing, but she gets attacked by cannibals. I guess she was some kind of Texas debutante, and there was some rumor about graves being dug up in order to preserve her grandfather's legacy. She and a couple of other people go out to make sure his is not disturbed. In this, they run across cannibals, and she's the only one to survive. She also gets a sequel in which these people, like the remaining family members, come after her, and she's able again to survive. But she then goes on and marries a bajillionaire, and so she has tons of money. And then there's Danny, who was attacked by her own brother. It's a little confusing because it's almost like Scream, where her brother had mental issues. So he's put in a mental institution. Things happen, he's able to escape, and he comes after her while she's babysitting. The idea is that, yes, it is him. Because in her sequel, what was it? It's confusing for me. In any case, she's initially attacked while babysitting. Oh, okay, so this is what it was. Her brother gets out of the mental institution. Whoever it is that comes attacks her is wearing a ghost mask. She's able to get away, but then she is re-attacked. So it's a sequel, but not a sequel. It's not like she gets away and this person is put away. When she is re-attacked, it is for certain her brother. He's not wearing a mask or anything, and so she ends up killing him. But then the question is, was he the guy in the mask, or was the guy in the mask someone else from the mental institution? It's cool in its ambiguity, but at the same time, there was so much uncertainty overall that I wished this one instance we didn't have the uncertainty. But she becomes a gun-toting, not lady of the law, but she likes to protect herself. She meets a woman, and they get married, and they go live on this ranch, and they start rehabilitating horses. Back to Adrian. Well, okay, and Lynnette. So Lynnette is not considered a true final girl, because what happened to her, and this is another movie I'm not really familiar with, but hers is called the Sleigh Bell Murders. Early in her life, like elementary school or middle school, she had begun writing to a pen pal. Her dad was not the nicest dude. He was the sheriff of the town. She would make comments in her letters, in a sense falling in love with her pen pal and talking about running away together and blah, blah, blah. Unbeknownst to her, this dude was bat crazy. And so he shows up at her house, murders her family, hangs her from a pair of antlers in her home, kills other people. He is then murdered. She gets a sequel because a year later she has been placed with a new family. It's going well. Then on Christmas Day, the brother comes. He escapes his mental institution and he comes and he murders more people. He bashes her head in. In neither case did she actually fight for herself. Like, she was able to survive the first attack by playing possum, by pretending to be dead. And then the second attack, I guess again, she sort of played dead after he nearly beat her to death. But then to make the whole scenario just a little bit weirder, she begins to have an affair with the policeman who rescued her. And then that's just its own can of worms, which I may or may not get into. But back to Adrian. Adrian had, after, the camp murders, buys the camp to make it into a rehabilitation center of sorts in which final girls can come, heal, be around other women of their situation, and can come to terms with what's happened to them. And so she ends up not showing up to their meeting. What these women soon learn is that she had been murdered. She had been murdered at her camp, and it seems to be the nephew of her monster was just taking vengeance on her. And she had become really wealthy. Like Marilyn, she had become very wealthy because the movies that were made about her experience did really, really well. But what happened is she's African American, and the main character of these movies is white. She's like, no, we can't have this. Like, this is not a true representation of me and of what happened. So she takes these people to town. She ends up getting the rights to all the movies. She has all this success, but she's murdered, and Lynnette, following her experiences, becomes very OCD and paranoid. And so we follow her on her very convoluted route back home, get to her house, which is armed to the bejesus. She's there talking to her only friend, which is called Fine. It is a pepper plant that was actually named Final because it was her final attempt at a plant. I thought it was clever. Nobody knows in this group. Nobody knows where she lives. But what she had done was she's like, so if something happened to me, nobody would know. So I do need to let somebody know how to check in on me. And so she had given Julia a letter with her address. And it was essentially in emergency only. If these certain criteria are met, open this letter, come find me. Julia shows up at her apartment. She's like, excuse you, what are you doing here? Sometime later, Julia reappears. She seems to be in distress, that she is being held at knife point by the ghost who had been her monster. Turns out it was a ruse in order to get inside. I'm a little confused as to how this all went down, but the ghost was a reporter. So I don't know if Julia went and got him and said, hey, let's come up with this grand scheme to get me inside, or if he had approached her and he was like pretending and maybe Julia didn't even know. In any case, Lynnette lets them in, and then a shootout happens. If I have another grievance, it is there were a lot of times where stuff just happened and I had no clue what was going on. It was really overwhelming. Like this shootout, Lynnette had fired at the ghost because, so her front door is protected by a steel cage, but it's not supposed to be bulletproof. So she is just shooting at this guy. Thankfully, the guy lied, whoever installed this steel cage, because bullets weren't getting through. So police were surrounding her building because people had called them about a shooting. Next thing you know, somebody's firing into her apartment. So I'm thinking, are the police firing into her apartment? It kills the reporter, injures Julia, whom Lynnette leaves. She just abandons her. Lynnette has escape plans. She has two options. The first one goes bust because she doesn't have a driver's license, but she does have this car and she has a few fake IDs. So she gets to her escape vehicle only to find out somebody has slashed the tires. And so she's like, oh my gosh, this guy, somehow he knew where my car is. So then she tries her second escape route, only to learn that this person has discovered that as well. So I'm like, this really traumatic, explosive moment just happened. And now all of her escape plans are foiled. She's frantic, and it feels frantic. So on one hand it's good, on one hand it's bad, but we get these really frantic moments that I feel like come on too soon, too sudden, and I don't understand how they tie in, like how they're happening, why they're happening. She goes to Dr. Carol, who is the woman, the therapist that leads their final support group. It's really strange. Dr. Carol has two kids, a mid-20s son named Sky, and then an 8-year-old named Pax. She's like, okay, Lynnette, yeah, I know that you've had a traumatic experience, but you need to calm down. You need to treat my children differently, with more respect. Don't do this, don't do that. And I'm like, I get it, Dr. Carol, she is in your home, but considering you're a therapist, you're not very empathetic or sympathetic right now. Then we learn Heather's halfway house has been burned down, and that Danny has been arrested for shooting a police officer. Lynnette is like, somebody is coming after the final girls. Our monsters are back. And then she realizes it's not just one person. Like, this is a concerted effort, because then people are coming out of the woodwork saying, oh no, I committed the murders that someone else was blamed for. All this crazy stuff is happening. And then Pax is a little menace. I didn't realize that this comic book he's trying to get her to buy was one that he drew. I thought it was just a comic book. Lynnette is like, I gotta get out of Dr. Carol's house. She enlists Sky, and she ends up at Marilyn's. But in order to actually get out of the house, she has to, Pax catches them. And so she pays him $100 for this comic book, which it's gonna be more important in the end if you hadn't figured it out. But it's kind of a really weird situation. We also see another recent event had happened at Camp Red Lake, which is Adrian's camp, in which there's another girl named Stephanie who was a final girl of sorts because her tennis coach started killing people or was abusing girls or something. Anyways, so she ends up at Camp Red Lake, and the next thing you know, it's the same thing that involves Adrian. All these people are dead, and she is the one who ends up pushing him out of the hayloft to kill him and be the final girl. So she runs across the file and blah blah blah, and she's losing her respect for Dr. Carol, but she ends up at Marilyn's. And Marilyn is throwing this big party to save gorillas or something, pandas, I don't know. Lynnette sneaks onto the property, is caught, and then Marilyn treats her like garbage, throws her into the guest house, which happens to be where Heather has been hiding out, and then Heather's getting on Lynette's case. We get this huge thing. Marilyn says, neither one of you can stay here. They all end up going to the hospice care because Danny's wife, Michelle, is in the end stages of cancer. And with Danny arrested, Michelle has been moved to hospice care. So the women, I don't know, so much goes on. And this whole storyline with Michelle, I liked it, but I didn't like it because I felt like it just got in the way. It was an extraneous storyline that we didn't quite need. Lynnette has convinced the women to go see Michelle, and then she convinces them that they need to break Michelle out of her hospice care to take her back to the ranch, of which no one knows how to get to. They end up at a park because they realize they're never gonna, she is on the brink of death. So they realize they're never gonna get to the ranch in time because, one, they don't know where it is. Two, even if they figured it out, she's not gonna survive. So Lynnette says what Michelle wants most is to see the flowers that Danny had planted for her. So they go to a park, they encounter a homeless man. Michelle dies. So Marilyn gives Heather her phone because they're like, we can't just leave a dead body here. She gives her the phone to call 911 or something. Michelle returns, and it turns out that she has called the guy that Lynnette used to sleep with after her encounters or experiences, and he is wanting to re-arrest Lynnette because new evidence has come to light that she had been in a sexual relationship with her potential murderer. Blah, 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 blah. So Lynnette ends up going to jail and is once again treated like dirt. She's trying to tell people this is what's going on, and nobody will listen to her. And then we get a little wrench in the mix, because at the beginning, when Julia and that reporter show up, it's to tell Lynnette that somebody is writing a book from their group. We suspect it's Heather, because Heather will do anything for money, but it's actually Lynnette. So Lynnette was being blackmailed by that reporter because he found out something about her, maybe like the location of where she lived. He was blackmailing her into writing a book with him so that he could get fame and fortune and all that stuff. She decides, I'm just going to double cross him. I'm not going to write a book with him. I will write the book and get fame and fortune and blah, blah, blah. Because she writes books. Like, that's how she makes her money, is under a pseudonym, blah, blah, blah. At the end of writing this book, she realizes there's no way she can ever publish it. Too much. Like, she can't do it. But somebody has found this book. They've emailed it to all the women in this support group, including Dr. Carroll. So she comes to visit Lynnette in jail, and this is the point where Lynnette starts to suspect that it's actually Dr. Carroll who's behind everything. So she's trying to tell people what her suspicions are. Nobody's listening to her. One cop who seems to be nice to her. Turns out he's something of a super fan. All he wanted to do was to kill her. The policeman from her hometown ends up stopping him. And then we get to another really weird situation in which he's supposed to be driving her back to Utah. He's acting like a complete and total jerk to her. Then he pulls over on the side of the road, unlocks her handcuffs, and he says, so here's the deal. I think something's going on, and this was all a ruse just to get you away. We're gonna pretend that you enlisted these people to come and overpower me, and then you're gonna be able to get away. Essentially, this is what it is to explain why she got away from him. But in return, we're gonna team up and write a book. She says, you know what? How about we just say I was really pissed off? She needs him in his family jewels, and she steals his prized car. Here's our spoiler, people. The culprit was not Dr. Carroll. It was actually Skye, which I guess I should mention this. I'd already mentioned this, but she had gone to visit Christy because she was like, I think Christy might know some stuff because Christy's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. She wants to protect Stephanie because she feels like Stephanie is in danger too. So she kidnaps Stephanie. Then they drive to like states and states over to where Christy lives. Christy is involved. I don't know. I think he might have some mental issues, some mental retardation. Whoever Keith is, he's not completely right in the head. Lynnette says, okay, Stephanie, you stay in the car. I'm going to go approach them. She gets caught. That's when they do the walkthrough of the creepy museum, and Christy shows how crazy she is. She reveals that she knows, like, yeah, Lynnette might not be a final girl yet, but she will be. This is all about Lynnette and Lynnette's story. They come back to the house, and Keith has discovered Stephanie. He's going to do something to her. We get the impression that maybe he's going to assault her in some way, and Lynnette is trying to say, don't do it, don't do it. She's a final girl. She's like me. And he's like, no, she's a monster. So here's a spoiler. Stephanie is teamed up with Skye. I think truly the nephew did have something to do with it. Stephanie, in her first final girl experience, had come to see Dr. Carroll. This is when Skye finds her file. He starts to groom her. Because I think what happened was he didn't like how much time and effort his mother put into her work, into these final girls. So he starts to groom Stephanie, and I think they then enlist the nephew. So the nephew does commit some murders, but it's all orchestrated by Skye and Stephanie. As Keith is going to do what he's going to do to Stephanie, Lynnette drives the car into the house, ends up killing both of them, rescues Stephanie, and then they get on their way. She's like, we've got to save the women, only to find that the women have gone to Camp Red Lake for a memorial for Adrian, and now she's really worried because the impression is that they've gone with Dr. Carroll. And so she's like, oh no, they're gonna die. She heads off to Danny's for some reason. They find Danny creating a bonfire because now that Michelle is dead, she has nothing to live for and blah, blah, blah. And they convince Danny to drive them to Camp Red Lake, only for Stephanie to attack them. Now Lynnette's like, oh, how did I not know Stephanie's behind it? And then only to find out that it was actually Skye. It is all really, really overwhelming. So as much as I liked the novel, there were a lot of overwhelming moments, like things just piled on top of each other. And it took me a couple tries to sort it all out. Danny and Lynnette get separated because, as I told you, she'd had her head bashed in. So she had a steel plate. So Stephanie's attempt to kill her didn't work because she hit Lynnette in her steel plate. Then Stephanie and Danny have it out. Stephanie drives off thinking she's killed both women. Somehow Lynnette, aided by Adrian's spirit, of a sense, is able to make it to the camp. Somehow Danny had also made it to the camp. Lynnette finds a bunch of camp workers dead. She also discovers Julia, and so then they're teaming up only to find Danny's splayed body. So then they bring her and they also to a cabin where Marilyn and Heather are. They're being pursued by someone in tactical gear that they assume is Stephanie. Because Adrian knew about Lynnette's fears, she had reinforced this cabin with stuff. They're able to seal themselves into this cabin. However, there is an escape hatch in the floor, so Lynnette, while Marilyn is using her satellite phone to call the police, Lynnette escapes. She discovers that it's not Stephanie, but it is Skye, and yeah, all of this was in an attempt to get back at his mother for the way that she did or did not parent him. This is when we're coming back to Stephanie and Skye's partnership. If she had not been a loose cannon, things would have been the way that they should have been, but because you never know how she's going to react, Lynnette and the women end up, getting saved in time and blah, blah, blah. We never know what happens to Heather. She may or may not have relapsed. Marilyn sets her up a bank account in which she can get money from every month, which somebody is getting money from this bank account every month. Danny, I don't know if she's permanently paralyzed, but she, at least at this point at the end of the novel, is in a wheelchair. Marilyn is fine. Lynnette had suffered grievous physical injuries, so she's in a whole world of hurt. But the novel ends with them reuniting for another final support group, or final girl support group, at the prison where Stephanie is being held because she is a final girl and so she needs the support group. And so it was a nice little conclusion. A lot of times in writing, it's about mirrors. It's about opening up something and then closing it in sort of the same way. I liked how this one was going because the opening with that first support group meeting is them essentially saying, we're calling it quits. And then at the end, knowing that not only are they not calling it quits, but they're including this final girl, or this final girl. It was a nice way to bring it full circle. I thought Skye needed a little bit more. He was an antagonist you didn't really see coming, but when you think back, it makes sense. So in this scenario, I'm fine. Sometimes I really hate when someone comes out of the blue and is the bad guy, but little things do add up to him ultimately being the bad guy. And what we learn, how we learn that he is the bad guy, is Lynnette finally reads that comic book. I almost forgot about it, but she finally reads that comic book and Pax had made Sky the bad guy? That is a question for me, because I want to know what Sky had done that Pax would see him as a bad guy. Dr. Carol doesn't seem to be that scared of her son. All you get is there's a really weird dynamic within the family. But honestly, the only thing we get is when Lynnette is trying to leave Dr. Carol's, she walks in on Sky, you know, having some alone time in front of his computer. He doesn't realize she's there because he can't hear her because it's music and stuff. When he does notice her there, it freaks him out, and he's like, and she says, I've seen worse. And so this is really the only thing we get to say that something's wrong or something's up with Sky. Maybe Hendrix didn't want to be that explicit about what Sky was watching for his alone time, but I wanted a little bit more clarity as to, because you get the sense that it's not normal alone time viewing, that it's disturbing in some sense. It wanted a little bit more clarity as to what was on his computer screen. I needed more development on him as to why he's so angry. Because that's kind of what the book is about, is getting into the monsters' psyches, into their mental states, to see as to why they would go after these women. Anyways, it was a great book. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, do all the stuff that lets me know I'm not alone. And I'll see you later. Bye.